Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. As always, thank you for listening, but the best thing you can do for the podcast is to share it on social media. If you share the podcast, tag me and tell me which world leader you would like me to discuss next. Alternatively, you can leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. The subject of this week's interview is one of the longest serving heads of state in Europe. In the last 18 months, he has become arguably the continent's most controversial leader, having ignored his defeat in a national election, jailed opposition leaders, and diverted a Ryanair flight flying over his country's airspace. That country is Belarus, and its leader is the truly unpleasant Alexander Lukashenko. This past week, Lukashenko has once again found himself in Western headlines after it was claimed that his regime has precipitated a migrant crisis on its border with Poland. Lukashenko has ruled Belarus as a dictator since 1994, and has increasingly irritated the Western Security Alliance. Indeed, the US, Canada, the EU and the UK all imposed sanctions on Lukashenko last year. The elephant in the room is Lukashenko's eastern neighbour, Russia's Vladimir Putin. Putin and Lukashenko have a close yet complex relationship, with each man believing, perhaps correctly, that their own survival depends on the survival of the other. My guest for this episode is the most high-profile guest I have had on the podcast so far. John Sweeney used to work for the BBC programmes Panorama and Newsnight, and now hosts the podcast Hunting Ghislaine, which has had over 3 million downloads. John also wrote a short book about Lukashenko in 2012 called Big Daddy. We discuss Lukashenko's rise to power, his relationship with Russia and the West, the 2020 elections, and whether Russia and Belarus are right to feel uncomfortable about Western foreign policy in Eastern Europe. This is a fantastic conversation, so without further ado, it's time to introduce Alexander Lukashenko. Good morning, John. How are you?
I'm slightly hungover, I have to say.
Lucky you. John, people will know you from your time on Panorama and Newsnight. You left the BBC 2 years ago. What have you been doing since then?
Well, I've been. I write thrillers, and I was delighted. My latest thriller is a thriller called The Useful Idiot, which is about fake news in Stalin's Moscow in 1933. The fake news has been around for a while, and it's about how the Moscow-based reporters suppressed the true story of the Holodomor, the Stalin's Great Famine in 1933, and how. There was one heroic journalist, Gareth Jones, opposed it, and to my delight, it was the philosopher John Gray made it his book of the year in the New Statesman, but no one's read it, so never mind. But the other thing I've done is, or two other things, is I also co-wrote a book with my friends Manuel Delia and Carlo Bonini, who are respectively a Maltese and Italian journalist, and together the three of us wrote a book about the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the fantastically brave Maltese journalist who was blown up in a car bomb. And that book's won an award in Malta, and we're hoping that it might be turned into a podcast series. And then the other thing which is exciting is that I did a podcast called Hunting Ghislaine about Ghislaine Maxwell, and the kind of USP, the kind of selling point of that, if you like, was something that, for example, the Netflix film Filthy Secrets didn't do, which was to look closely at who Ghislaine Maxwell was and in particular to look at her father, Robert Maxwell. And the moment it hit number one on the UK Apple podcast chart, on the trailer alone, and it stayed there for weeks, and it's had 3.5 million downloads, and has led to a book deal and a potentially a TV drama series for somebody like Netflix. we're all waiting for the trial. Ghislaine Maxwell denies essentially grooming underage girls for her then partner, Jeffrey Epstein, and her trial will take place soon. So she denies it, and quite rightly, everybody's innocent until proven guilty. But what you've got is, anyway, for me personally, it was a very therapeutic success. And one of my mates, because I left the BBC in an unhappy way, and I was cross with them, they were cross with me. But one of my mates said that the Hunting Ghislaine podcast was the best comeback since Lazarus.
It's quite the compliment. It is a fantastic listen. I didn't actually know a great deal about the character of Robert Maxwell as well. I'm a little too young to sort of remember him being in the public eye, but he's a fascinating character as well. In many ways, I think more interesting than either Epstein or Ghislaine. The subject of our discussion today, John, is Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. To set the scene a bit, Belarus, at least in its current form, became independent during the early 90s. Prior to that, it had been a republic within the Soviet Union. Can you talk a bit about the role that Belarus played within the Soviet Union?
So Belarus is, I mean, it's a strange place. So basically, Belarus's politics has been formed, or should I say, deformed by the intense suffering it experienced during the Second World War, because basically it was in the way. It was one of the places that the German army, the Nazis, marched through on their way to get to Moscow, and then on their way back. And the number of, I think the population, it's something like 1 in 4 men died. I mean, terrible numbers. The Ukraine is the same geography. Belarus sits, for example, between Poland and what is now the Russian Federation. Geographically, it's a big place, not heavily populated, and very, very rural, kind of, and this history of the land was kind of ravaged twice, once the Nazis going that way, and then when the Nazis went that way back. An awful lot of death, and that has led to a kind of a natural fear of political change which could lead to war, and a kind of a natural conservatism or a fear of political violence and a fear of war, which is kind of baked into society. So it is, and it's still, as I said, very, very agricultural and very, very Soviet. And the trick, and it's a confidence trick that Alexander Lukashenko has played on the people of Belarus, is to say to them, listen, without me, things will be much, much worse. And by and large, through a series of measures, some of which is like bribing people with a sense of giving them a false sense of security, but giving them some sense of security, not changing very much. So it is, for my money, one of the most still Soviet societies inside what used to be the Soviet Union. So that, and I recommend anybody who's interested in this stuff to watch it. When you go. But for example, I would not say to any young student, journalist, or somebody who's interested in politics or history to go to Syria, full stop, or Iraq, or Afghanistan. Don't go there, because you need to have money and a big organisation behind you to take the risk. Belarus is different. I think if you're an activist, you could get into trouble, and don't go if you're an activist. But if you watch yourself, you look after yourself, then Belarus is a relatively safe place to go. Don't go on your own, go with friends and behave, and remember this is a dictatorship. However, it is kind of fascinating because it's like a time machine. Because if you can go there, you can get a flavour of what the Soviet Union was like. And what you've got is, for example, the KGB, the secret police, is still called the KGB. Lukashenko hasn't bothered changing it. So that's how weird it is. He takes over. Basically what happens is all of the old bits and bobs of the Soviet Union have a kind of a shuffle of the pack. And in 94, the old Soviet bosses, who were a bit corrupt, who were a bit rubbish, who were part of what was clearly a broken past, they get knocked out. There are free elections, and Lukashenko stands and says, listen, I am neither of the left nor of the right. I am of the centre, and I am against people stealing. And that was his big pitch. And essentially, that was the last democratic election anybody had. He's been in power now for whatever it is, so 27, 28 years. And he is a bit of a fascist in a loose way. But in particular, what he is, he's a kind of Brezhnevite Soviet dinosaur who hasn't changed his scales one little bit.
So just to put this in a bit more context, John, this election where he's brought to power is 1994. Lukashenko was born in 1954, so he's in his late 60s now. That puts him in his mid-30s during the final years of the Soviet Union. What was his experience of working in the Soviet Union, and how did that kind of... Well, it's clearly informed his leadership from what you've said about Belarus as a country, but how did he first become involved in politics within the Soviet Union?
So I should explain to listeners that I've written a short book about this, which is called Big Daddy. It's like 25,000 words. And although I will get round to your question, Tom, but the context of this is that there was a very strange bombing incident in Minsk Metro. Several people were killed in the bomb, and 2 young men were prosecuted and convicted and then executed for this outrage. And for Newsnight, I went to Belarus, BBC Newsnight. I went to Belarus undercover, interviewed the mother of one of the executed men, and I came away convinced that the evidence against the men was horribly flawed, and I believe that they were completely innocent, and the bomb in fact was placed by the KGB as a deliberate black operation to instill fear, and that would then justify a crackdown to bring down the democratic opposition, and that Lukashenko was an evil dictator, and that is what drove me to write the book. So that is that's my back history, why I'm telling this story. And Lukashenko, the thing about him is that he was illegitimate, and teased when he was a kid for being illegitimate. He's a big man, physically a very, very big man. Whenever it's kind of fascinating to when you see pictures of him and Putin. I've met Vladimir Putin. Putin's really quite short. Like, I'm not saying he's a state-registered dwarf or anything, but he's like 5'6", 5'6.5". I can remember almost towering over him, and I'm 5'11". Lukashenko is a good 6'2", 6'3". He's a pig of a man, Lukashenko, big, muscly guy. My friend Gabriel Gatehouse, who used to report on the Russian area stories for the BBC, now he's at Newsnight. But Gabriel found out that Lukashenko had been the boss of a pig farm. It was a collective farm that looked after pigs. And Lukashenko was sort of this big collective pig farmer. And he had a history of, if he fell out with his staff, and he would hit them. And Gabriel interviewed 9 people in the pig farm, and all 9, 100% of those polled, had all been hit by Lukashenko. He'd slapped them. So that's the kind of man he is. However, and in my book, I describe him as he's the way he talks. Belarusian is obviously, it's part of the Russian kind of near, they like to call it near Russia. Belarusian is, many Belarusians will argue with this, but I think that it is fair to say that it is a language in its own right, and it's a dialect. And it's kind of similar to this. Anyway, if you listen to Belarusian, you can work out most of it, and it sounds like Wurzel Gummidge. So that one of the analogies I make, that Lukashenko is a cross between Wurzel Gummidge and Adolf Hitler. Now, to an extent, the Hitler thing is that's not right. He is much more like a mixture of Wurzel Gummidge in talking like a West Country pig farmer, "Who are my dear," and like Brezhnev or one of the old Soviet dinosaurs, and he has those worldviews. So deeply, very, very to the right on cultural issues, on for example, how he talks about Jews, which is where the Hitler analogy comes through. He says things which are just kind of like horribly anti-Semitic, but also he's misogynist. He's a dinosaur. He went around hitting everybody who worked with him when he was the boss of the pig farm. But what he has got is a real earthy energy. Now, I think there's a wonderful book it's a novel called The Porcupine, and I've forgotten the name of the writer. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer. Damn. Anyway, the novel's called The Porcupine, and it's a study of the Soviet dictator in Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkov. And what's fascinating, it's a novelization of Zhivkov. Now, Zhivkov was actually less bad than Nicolae Ceausescu, who's his next door neighbour. But what The Porcupine captures brilliantly is is Julian Barnes is the writer. What The Porcupine captures brilliantly is the kind of demonic energy that the dictator has, and that also applies to Lukashenko. So this is the man who is unbelievably arrogant and believes in his arrogance. And with everybody who's arrogant, deep down there is the arrogance masks an insecurity. It masks deep anxieties. So as I said, this man was brought up illegitimate, and he was bullied at school because he was illegitimate, because he was a bastard. And he's never properly recovered from those humiliations. And so what he does is, with his very, very, very conservative and kind of ultra-nationalistic way, he is locked in as the leader of the country, and he knows he can only leave power in a box. There is a plan for succession, and that's his son. And his son was, when I was there in 2012, his son would have been about 9 or 10. And now he's in his early 20s. And what was weird was that there is a kind of love. I described it, you'll know that from Tom and Jerry, there's Butch, the dog, and he's got a little puppy, kind of Butch, and he just goes, "That's my boy, that's my boy." And that's exactly what Lukashenko was like. So that when Lukashenko went to see the Pope, he brought along his lad. I think his lad's called Nicholas. I'm right. You're nodding. Good.
Yeah.
It's far too early in the morning for me, Tom. But there's the Pope. There's Lukashenko, and there's this 9-year-old kid, and he's the deputy prime minister or and that's the actual role. So this is a weird. As well as being Soviet, it's a kind of like a weird, crazy monarchy from some daft bit of kind of Ruritania, and so what you've got is a man who is streetwise, who is thuggish, who will hit you, hits people who work for him, who is very, very big physically, who is incredibly reactionary, who is very, very insecure and anxious, and he masks this with this unbelievable arrogance. Here's the thing. In any normal society, people would have got rid of this joke a long time ago. The problem is the neighbour, and the neighbour is Vladimir Putin. Now, he's the...
Well, if I can just come in there, John. Putin, by dint of Russia being Belarus's largest neighbour, its largest trading partner, a former member of the Soviet Union as well, Putin is the most important foreign leader in the Lukashenko story. How people often sort of lump them together. How similar are their leadership styles, and does Lukashenko to some extent take his lead from Putin?
Good question. There was a fascinating moment where, your listeners may well know this already, but what happened was there was a vote, a big election, and basically the opposition won, and Lukashenko cheated and locked up, tortured, arrested tons and tons of the opposition people. And after a lot of street protests, Lukashenko prevailed, because everybody who opposed him physically and openly got locked up and got beaten up and tortured in prison. Some people died. There's a moment when the two buddies, they meet somewhere on the Black Sea, I think, and they go fishing, and they hug and remember the kind of the weird physics of it is that Putin's the little guy, and then there's this enormous sort of meathead who gives him a kind of cuddle. In reality, in terms of power, the sizes are almost exactly the wrong way round. That Lukashenko is, in terms of power, the dwarf, and Putin is the monster. Putin's problem is that he doesn't want change. He too knows that he can only leave the Kremlin in a box, because if he dares find somebody who succeeds him, then the danger is at some point his successor, to make himself more popular, to show that he is new, to show that the change is real, will have Putin locked up, and then Putin knows he's killed too many people and stolen too much money. Of course, the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin deny this. They deny any wrongdoing. But that is my take on this. So Putin does not want change. He's got to stay in power. If there's change in Belarus, many people in Moscow and St. Petersburg will say, well, if our country cousins, if the Wurzel Gummages of this world can overthrow their Wurzel Gummidge, then let's go and get rid of Vladimir Putin. So Lukashenko, this dinosaur, is allowed to survive in a kind of Soviet version of Jurassic Park because it suits Vladimir Putin. So the power dynamic here is this guy is an international joke, but Putin doesn't want change, because if there's change in Belarus, then change may start knocking on the door in Moscow, and he doesn't want that to happen. And that is how this hideous joke of a man, this caricature of everything that's wrong and completely out of date, has managed to stay in power for so long, because Vladimir Putin wants it like that. And basically, Putin takes over in 2000, or actually in late 1999. Lukashenko is there. He's not causing any trouble because he has a very Soviet mindset, as does Putin. And Putin essentially he's actually said this, that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century is the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, stop there, boys and girls. So, not the First World War, not the rise of Adolf Hitler, not the Second World War, but the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, that is a horrible worldview, but that is Putin's worldview, and that is also the view of Lukashenko. So Lukashenko is a sweet ideological and power fit for Vladimir Putin, and that's why he's allowed to stay there. And of course, the Russian secret state has helped Lukashenko hold the fort and supported him in all their secret ways, so that he prevailed. And that is the tragedy of Belarus in a sentence. Lukashenko is a thug and a bully and a very, very bad man, but he's allowed to stay in power because there's a bigger bully next door and he doesn't want him out.
That's very interesting. I'd like to come on to the geopolitical aspect of it towards the end of the interview. It's worth noting, obviously, that the Belarus-Russia relations have not always been completely harmonious between the two leaders. I think there have been strains, commercial strains over things like milk, famously. But obviously, since it became independent, Belarus has accrued another quite large neighbour, which is the European Union. The EU now borders Belarus by dint of having Poland as a member. Looking at Belarus, you think that being in between these two blocks might cause it some quite big problems. But alternatively, it could be quite advantageous if Belarus were to try and play the two blocks off against each other. How has Lukashenko reacted to life in between Russia and the EU?
So what he does, and he does it in a clever way, is he plays. It's not just the European Union. He plays the West off against Russia. Occasionally, he goes and sweet talks the Chinese, and so I was interested when I was there. I went along to the Chinese embassy because there was talk of Lukashenko becoming a kind of allowing Belarus to become an outpost for Chinese money, Chinese power, in a way that the Kremlin wouldn't like. Now, in reality, what he's done is he was being flirtatious, and the reality is he's kind of family with Putin. But what he does do on occasion is say, listen, and he did this in, I think, 2007, 2008, 2009. There was a sense of a kind of the spring in Minsk, a Minsk spring, where he opened up a bit to the European Union. The European Union offered him money, I think, lots of euros to cease being a dictator. What Europe was hoping for was an unfreezing of the political process, somebody new, somebody they could deal with, then potentially Belarus could, down the track, join NATO, join the European Union. And that is the very thing that alarms Putin, that Putin doesn't want, because that means that, for example, and you've got to understand all of this in the context of the Nazi invasion of Operation Barbarossa, that if you're Russian, in particular of Putin's generation, you fear invasion from the West, and you fear the West, and the West's out to get us. That is not. I don't think that is the case. That is not what what the European Union, the West, is about. But that is their real fear of both Putin and Lukashenko, and so, although Lukashenko has flirted on occasion with the European Union, it's only a flirtation. Basically, Russia and Putin's very old-fashioned Soviet paranoid view of the West is the one he buys into, and that's his real base. But he does flirt with the West. Now, there's a point at which there have been too many failed and fake elections, and the last one was the worst and the bloodiest repression of an election. So that I think the European Union would say to Lukashenko, if he tried to flirt with them again, he said, "I'm sorry, we don't believe you. we don't believe you because it's gone too far. But remember, this is part of the trick that's going on, that both Putin and Lukashenko have elections. Now, I actually think that had Putin had an election against Navalny, he could have lost, because Navalny has a real presence. But of course, Navalny wasn't allowed to stand, and now Navalny's in prison. However, and this is one of the strange constraints that these people, both Putin and Lukashenko, have, is they've got to look as though they're democratic, even though they're not. So they do have to have elections, and elections are in the diary. And then what they have to do is to get through the electoral period. And some of that, there's some window dressing, bring observers, offer them people who are a bit dodgy, who come along and say, oh yes, this was a free and fair election. And they're being they're Westerners who might be a little bit corrupt or biddable or not honest and open people. Whatever it is, it's window dressing. The reality is that he's sticking with Vladimir Putin.
Just to play devil's advocate for a second to what you said a minute ago, John, about the Russian perception of Western encroachment being misguided. If you look at a map of where NATO has gone in the last 20 years, it is kind of indisputable that it has encroached upon the former Soviet satellite states and what Russia would term its near abroad. Poland is now a member of NATO and the EU. The Baltic states are also members. The Bush administration was very keen to get Georgia to join NATO. I do understand what you mean about it perhaps being an old-fashioned worldview that Putin holds, but I do sometimes also think that if the shoe was on the other foot and the Russians were trying to engage, let's say, Ireland in a military alliance, I think we would rightfully have a bit more to say about it. Now, don't you? Do you sort of at least understand the Russian perspective on this, even if you don't think it's completely credible?
You've got to understand Russian paranoia, and so the Russians and the Belarusians and the Ukrainians paid a bigger price in blood in the victory over the Nazis than any other nation. And what drives the anxiety, particularly of the older Soviet generation, and that's Vladimir Putin right there, but also Lukashenko, is fear of invasion from the West and that the West is out to get us. However, you've also got to look at historical facts. The Eastern European countries, including, for example, Poland and the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria, etc., were their own independent nations up till the weather changed with the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939. And so the idea that the map of Europe should remain locked in the form, the effective stitch-up first set out in the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact is quite wrong and unsustainable. It's proper that there is an independent democratic Poland and the Baltics and all of those places. So the idea that the Soviet map is the right map is wrong, because it's not just the Soviet map, it's the Nazi Soviet map, and that's a no straight there. So the problem is that what has happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall is an encroachment on the Soviet land is nonsense, because that map was drawn up effectively in August 1939 with the Nazis. So that's not a goer. Where it becomes more difficult and more sensitive is when you've got places that were in the old Soviet Union, not and that is a problem. But I think this is absolutely a fair point to make, is that I have no view that whether Belarus should be part of Russia or not. And I'm sure nearly every major politician in Europe and in North America would agree with me. What I care about is human rights. I don't care about the political relationship between Belarus and Russia. I care that there should be free and fair elections in Russia and in Belarus, and they're not. And so my take on this is that Putin and Lukashenko's paranoia about change is driven by their fear of democratic process, and I believe in democracy. They do not. So what they're doing is they are addressing our belief in democracy and our concern for proper democratic process, and they're saying that we're seeking their territory, their land. No, we're seeking proper democratic process. And what's happening is a confusion of those two things. So that's what I would say to push back at your question.
Let's talk about the 2020 election that took place in Belarus. This, as you said, I think the opposition won this election. Lukashenko lost the election and has stayed in power. He's imprisoned a lot of the people that organised against him, that protested against him. How much support do you think there is for Lukashenko in Belarus today?
I would have thought he would get like maybe 1 in 4 votes. I mean, so what you've got is, what you've got to remember is this is still a very agricultural society. It's not very industrial. You've got a brain drain. If you're bright, you leave. He's got great control over TV. A lot of people are on the internet. And you've got this terrible history. So your grandma will remember awful times. And there's a fear of political change, of political disruption, because the Nazis might come back. So there is a whole chunk of people, obviously, so essentially it works like this. The people who voted for Brexit in Britain, who voted for Trump in the States, those people will be with Lukashenko. However, I think that he's been in power now for what, as I said, almost 3 decades. And there is a sense that he is boring and stupid and corrupt, and he presides over corrupt and brutal regime. And everybody, for example, you drive a car, you get stopped by the traffic police, they fine you. It's all crooked everywhere you go. There is a kind of an observance of the Soviet-style social contract. But of course, that's being undermined because we're also in 2021. But I would have thought that he's still got a constituency. He would have lost that vote, but he would have got something like 1 in 4 people. A quarter of the country is still with him. But he has lost. I think he lost face and he lost the argument. One of the cruelest things that happened, and everybody should look the story up, was that there was an opposition activist and his girlfriend, and they were travelling from. They'd been on holiday, and I think they were going back to Poland or something like this, and on a Ryanair flight. And what happened was the Belarusian KGB faked a security alert, a bomb. There was a fake message that there was a bomb on the jet, and they made, as it was crossing Belarusian airspace, they made the pilot land in Minsk, and the activist and his girlfriend were taken off. And then after some time in one of Lukashenko's torture chambers, both of them came on and told national television that they were effectively terrorists, and they feel delighted to confess this. Obviously, they'd been tortured off camera. Almost certainly the boy had been told, you've got to say this, or if you don't, things will not go well for the woman you love. That's how this stuff works. And this was hideous. This was a hideous act of state terrorism by the Lukashenko regime. I also did not like the way Ryanair played it, and I did not like the way they dealt with it. It was there was a press release using the sort of passive tense, which didn't address this. What's happened since, by the way, is that most European airlines now do not fly around Belarus. That means that they no longer pay the Belarusian government money to overfly. I suspect that over time they'll come back again, because most airplane companies aren't that bothered about human rights. Shame on them. But that's a moment. I think the hijacking by the state, for me, it's a line in the sand which shows the contempt for the rule of law and proper behaviour by the Lukashenko regime. So it's very difficult. At the same time, I mean, there's a hedge fund company, or there's a company somewhere in the city of London which has sorted out bonds, has helped Belarus with sovereign debt. And one of the things I'd like to do next year is to try and to do some journalism to try and track down the enablers, the financial enablers in the city of London and in New York and everywhere else of the Lukashenko money machine, because he also needs money to survive. At the moment, there is a kind of judgment that what's happening in Belarus isn't so bad that we should be serious about doing anything about it. And also there is the separate and bigger problem that Putin wants Lukashenko to survive, and for the moment the West isn't serious about standing up to Vladimir Putin. So even though he stole the election, even though he broke international law by hijacking this jet, nobody serious with money and power, I'm talking about people like Joe Biden or Boris Johnson, thinks that that Lukashenko's crimes are worth serious scrutiny, let alone let alone doing something about it. So at the moment, this crook is getting away with it.
In the kind of pantheon of horrible leaders, John, in the world, we obviously have put sanctions on Lukashenko now, along with the Americans, the EU, Canada. We've put sanctions on him, but this is not something that we do to other regimes with very poor human rights records. A country like Saudi Arabia would spring to mind. This is a question that goes a lot further than Lukashenko, but of the pantheon of awful leaders in the world, do you think it's acceptable for a Western country to kind of basically pick and choose which awful regimes it decides to sanction, either financially or by direct military means, and it decides to basically turn a blind eye to other ones?
There's a serious problem about Western hypocrisy, and
yes.
And how we deal with the Saudi regime is there's a whole series of nightmares. Number one, at the moment, the price of gas and petrol is going up. If we had a serious argument with the people who run Saudi Arabia, our gas and oil prices will go up much, much more. So the problem is we're dependent upon the Saudi regime to keep our energy supply and to secure it. And therefore, the unhappy political judgment is that we don't want to pick a fight with these people, because otherwise there will be really, really long queues outside our petrol stations.
Yeah.
And that's the political reality. I am a massive fan of the move to electric car and the bicycle and all of that, because the two people who hold the most petrochemicals are Vladimir Putin and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, also known as Mr. Bonesaw after the Khashoggi thing. So the problem is that we can't switch to the electric car overnight. And although we're going in the right direction, we can't do that. And it would be an act of economic self-harm for example, Britain to pick a fight with the Saudi regime because they supply a vital part of our economy, which is cheap petrol, and that's the real world political problem. So that there is some hypocrisy there. There's also some hypocrisy with the way we deal with China. By the way, China needs us because we're the customer far more than we need them. So I think we can actually do much more in terms of standing up for human rights in Tibet, for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, where a monstrous crime. There are two monstrous crimes happening right now. There are three. There is the monstrous crimes in Tibet, the monstrous crimes in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, and the monstrous crimes against the Hong Kongers. Now, I think we can push much harder against places, against China. For example, I think the Beijing Olympics is going to be like the Berlin Olympics in 1936, and I think we can push back it much further. But because we can't tell the people who run Saudi Arabia what we think of them clearly, because they are massively important to our economic well-being, and the same applies also to our relations with the Chinese Communist Party who rule China. Because of those problems, it does not mean that we should be inert where we can make a difference. And I think we can make a difference because Belarus is not important to us economically, and therefore we can say what we think. Actually, I think that we should have, after the hijacking, we should have been much tougher. And as I said, one of the things I want to do next year is to investigate the extent to which the City of London is helping out Lukashenko with its checkbook, and I want public scrutiny on that, because we can do something about Belarus in a way that we can't do something about Riyadh, about the people who run Saudi Arabia, because of our economic dependency on oil. So I get it. Yes, we are being hypocritical, but that's a problem we've got. Otherwise, we can be absolutely wonderful about it, but there'll be a problem which our populations won't like at all, and therefore the people proposing kind of principled action against Saudi Arabia have got to deal with the problem of our economic dependence on Saudi Arabia at the moment. We can, however, do something against Belarus, and let's do it.
Good answer. Just to bring this to a close,
yes,
John. In 15 or 20 years' time, where do you see Belarus? Do you think it will still be aligned with Russia, still working on this kind of post-Soviet autocratic model with Lukashenko, or perhaps another Lukashenko in power? Or do you think it will basically be like Estonia, kind of Western aligned, an EU member, democratic, people go there on holiday? What do you think?
So the thing with dictatorships, Tom, is they're not like democracies. There is no planned change. So one version is complete stasis. A second version is there is real change, but it's you can't predict it because it's geological. Like it's not like the joy of democracy is there are elections. We know when the elections are, and then we don't know what the outcome will be. And the Tories have been in power for a long time. Who knows? They may slip out of power. But here you've got dictatorships which don't, where you can't predict. The change is geological. Everything looks stable, and then bang, everything's gone. And I can remember vividly, I went to Romania in 1985, and I never did. And then I was back 4 years later in 1989. And then, I watched on television on Christmas Day in Bucharest, we saw the video of Nicolae Ceausescu being machine gunned by his own soldiers. So that was the the end of him, and no one predicted it. Hardly anyone predicted the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, because we didn't see it coming. But the big thing is that Lukashenko lives or dies because of what happens next door. So what happens to the neighbor, Vladimir Putin, is the big thing. The moment Putin's out, I wouldn't give Lukashenko longer than a week if Putin falls. If Putin dies, if he's replaced. Now, there's an argument, which many of my friends who I like very much say, is that whoever takes over when Putin will be just Putin with a slightly higher platform shoes. But I feel that even when, there was this fake switch between Medvedev and Putin, so that Putin could wriggle round the rules of how long he can be president, even on that time, Medvedev had a little bit more power, and and Russia felt like a softer, less awful place when Medvedev was there. So I think the character of political leadership matters, and that whoever replaces Putin will be better. I'm an optimist, not a pessimist, and that's trouble for Lukashenko. So I think that if Lukashenko goes, then Belarus is likely to become softer, sweeter, and a happier place. By the way, it's very, very beautiful, and the lack of kind of economic development is kind of it's a very, very strange and fascinating place. Wonderful, funny people with an awful boss. I hope and pray that one day things will change.
I think that's a good note to end on, John. Where can people find your work? You mentioned Hunting Ghislaine. Where can people find the podcast? Where can people find your books?
Yeah, so Hunting Ghislaine, it's on all the platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google, blah, blah, blah. Hunting Ghislaine with John Sweeney. Ghislaine is spelled Ghislaine. And then, I don't like them very much, but Amazon is where all the books are. I've written 12 books, 4 novels. The Useful Idiot's my latest. My most successful is a thriller set in Burma during the war called Elephant Moon, and 2 other books, Cold and Road. Cold is set in modern-day Russia. Big Daddy is I've written 8 non-fiction books. Big Daddy is the one about Lukashenko. I think my first book is about Ceausescu. I'm kind of fascinated with dictators. And, of course, I've written a book about Scientology, The Church of Fear. By the way, Tom, are you a member of the Church of Scientology?
Yes.
Well, then, fuck off.
Yeah, I send the 500 quid every month, so I definitely don't have.
Good.
Thank you very much, John. It's been really good talking to you.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.